This story is inspired by true events, reimagined for reflection. They say some moments echo longer than the words themselves. At a global summit hall lined with power suits, gold chandeliers, and carefully rehearsed smiles, the air shifted, not with a shout, but with one man standing still. In that room of presidents and billionaires, an African leader rose, young, composed, dressed not in polished tailoring, but in the camouflage uniform of a soldier. While others rehearsed diplomacy, he carried something older, the weight of truth. He wasn't the first to face Donald Trump in debate, but he was the first to do it like this. No finger-pointing, no anger, just truth, stripped of fear. That was the moment the world paused, and that's where our story begins. Your words are not our reality. It started with the usual pageantry. The world's most powerful leaders had gathered in Geneva, an opulent hall filled with polished marble and million-dollar lighting. Cameras flashed, protocols were repeated, and on the surface, everything seemed scripted. Then Trump spoke. With his familiar bravado, he turned his attention to Africa. When you look at Africa, he said, you just see confusion. You don't know who's in charge of anything. Honestly, it's a disaster. A few awkward chuckles surfaced. Some leaders looked down. Others pretended not to hear. But one man didn't move. He didn't smirk, didn't shift uncomfortably. He stood. That man was Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso. Barely in his 30s, he had no entourage, no ego, just the silent gravity of someone who had come not to speak to power, but as it. As he made his way to the front, the quiet shuffle of his boots on marble echoed louder than applause. He didn't grab the mic, he didn't raise his voice. Instead, he looked straight at Trump and said, "With respect, sir, you don't know what Africa is." The room fell silent, not forced silence, but the kind that happens when something real happens in a place designed to avoid it. And then, Traoré spoke, not to defend Africa, but to reveal it. Africa is not a mess, he said. Africa is memory, strength, legacy. His voice didn't crack. His hands didn't shake. Yet each word struck harder than thunder. He painted a portrait not of poverty, but of resilience, of civilizations that taught and traded before maps even marked Europe's borders. When your ancestors came to our soil, he said, they didn't find chaos, they found wisdom, gold, healing, and you didn't come to partner, you came to take. There were no notes in his hand, the words came from somewhere older, somewhere lived. You call us corrupt, he continued, but who taught the bribe? Who built the banks that hide our stolen billions? Who signs the contracts that strip us of our land and pay us in silence? The room shifted. Some looked away, others leaned in. Still, he kept going. We are not angry, he said. We are awake. And then he told them about Malik. When Traoré spoke, he wasn't just addressing a room. He was calling history into the present. His words carried centuries. You drew borders on maps with no thought for our languages, our tribes, our roots. Then when we stood back up, you handed us systems meant to collapse. Some faces stiffened, others lowered their gaze. No one interrupted. No one dared. Yes, we have problems, he said, but why? He didn't pause for pity. He wasn't asking. He was showing. Your phones need our minerals. Your desserts are sweet because of our cocoa. Your cars and factories burn our oil. And in return, our children go to bed hungry. Our students walk streets with degrees and no charm. Our hospitals beg for medicine, while your companies post record profits. His words weren't accusations, they were facts, delivered not in rage but with razor-sharp calm. And then came the question that cut deeper than all. You call us corrupt, but what do you call those who pay for the corruption? The Western companies that hand over suitcases of money to steal from us? The banks that hide billions while our clinics run dry? The silence when war breaks out over contracts signed in your boardrooms? The silence in the summit hall was now complete. Even the reporters, trained to detach from emotion, had frozen mid-sentence. Cameras blinked, but no one dared speak. Because the words weren't just heard, they were felt. Traoré wasn't finished. With his voice steady, he said, "Let me tell you a story." A new kind of silence came, anticipatory, heavy. There is a boy named Malik, 12 years old. He wakes before the sun, not for school, but to walk 6 miles barefoot to fetch water. For his mother, his younger siblings. He paused, not for drama, but because even breath felt sacred in that moment. Every day, Malik walks past hills full of gold, not metaphor, real gold, dug from his land, shipped to your vaults, to your jewelry, to your smartphones. But he has never touched it. That gold has never touched him. A woman near the front wiped her eyes. When he returns home, if there is food, he eats. Then he studies. By candlelight, he doesn't dream of Europe. He doesn't dream of escape. He dreams of becoming an engineer. Not to leave Africa, but to build Africa. To dig wells so no child walks like him. To build roads so his village can stand. He dreams not for exit, but for dignity. Traoré let the story sit. No one moved. And then, with a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "That child's dream is not a visa, it is justice." The tension in the room cracked, not because it broke, but because something had finally entered. Something that had long been kept outside. Truth. "You ask why we are angry," he continued, "but we are not. We are awake. Malik does not need charity. He needs power. A world that does not rob him before he's even begun." That final line didn't fade. It clung to the marble, the chandeliers, the breathing of everyone present. In that moment, Malik was more than a boy. He was a symbol, a voice, a mirror. "You talk about corruption," he began, "but you use the word as if it were born in our villages. It wasn't. It was perfected in your capitals, protected in your banks, hidden behind your laws. Your companies write the contracts, your lobbyists draft the loopholes, your firms create the channels where money leaves Africa and never returns. Money stolen from our land doesn't sleep in huts. It rests under glass towers in New York, London, Dubai, and Brussels." He looked around the room slowly, then said softly, "You point fingers at our presidents for taking bribes, but who hands them over? Who builds the systems that reward theft and punish honesty? Your corporations, your trade deals, your silence." Then he raised his hand ever so slightly, a simple gesture, but it landed like a gavel. "Right now, as I speak, there are children in Burkina Faso digging for gold with bare hands. That gold will never pay for their classrooms or hospitals. It will decorate your watches, fund your tech, and fuel your luxury." The room remained frozen. Malik walks past those mines every morning, but his father died in one, buried alive in a collapse working for a foreign firm that vanished without an apology. His school has no roof. His books are torn, his dreams are unprotected, and yet you tell us to be patient. Traoré let the silence hang, not for effect, but because the truth had weight that needed space. "That boy doesn't need pity," he said again. "He needs power, not a charity gala, not a trending hashtag. Real change. That's what's stolen from us. Not just resources, not just time, but the chance to shape our own futures. You say Africa has failed, but how can a tree grow if you keep cutting its roots? Every time we rise, you move the finish line. Every time we build, you rewrite the rules. Every time we hope, you buy the ground beneath our feet." He paused again as a quiet gasp broke out from somewhere near the middle. No laughter now, no smirks. Just the kind of attention reserved for a rare moment when people realize they are witnessing something that can't be undone. "Africa was never allowed to succeed," Traoré said, his voice lower now, but heavier, as if centuries stood behind each word. "From colonial flags to IMF conditions, from foreign aid riddled with traps to broken infrastructure we never asked for, we were given broken tools and then blamed when the house collapsed." The faces in the crowd told their own stories. Some looked ashamed, others thoughtful. Some simply stared ahead as if hoping the speech would end before the next truth arrived. But Traoré wasn't done. He didn't scream. He didn't slam the table. His power came from never needing to. Rather, he said calmly, "We are not begging. We are reclaiming. We are not asking for permission. Africa is standing now, and I will stand first." With those words, he didn't wait for applause. But it came, a single clap, a second. Then a wave rising from the back and sweeping forward as leaders from Latin America, Asia, and finally parts of Europe stood and joined in. Not all, not easily, but visibly. The room was shifting. Cameras flashed, social feeds exploded. Journalists who had planned to summarize policy drafts were now scrambling to record what history was doing before their eyes. Within minutes, his words were no longer just echoing in the summit hall. They were crossing oceans. In Nairobi, Johannesburg, Lagos, social media lit up with clips of the moment he said, "Africa was never allowed to succeed." The hashtag spread faster than any official statement ever could. In universities across the continent, students gathered in dorm rooms and canteens, replaying his speech on phones and laptops. In Ghana, a political science class stopped mid-lecture to project his words on the board. In Nigeria, a rapper dropped a freestyle titled "Stand First" using Traore's final line as a chorus. In Kenya, a school teacher printed the transcript and handed it out in class. "This," she said, "is what courage looks like." And the streets responded too. In Ouagadougou, thousands marched waving flags and replaying his speech on loudspeakers from open car windows. Murals appeared overnight, depicting Traoré standing with children holding books and tools, not weapons, while painted above them were the words, "Not waiting, rising." His image was everywhere, but it wasn't about his face. It was the symbol, what he represented. Africa not as a continent begging for mercy, but rising with memory and pride. Even outside of Africa, there was a tremor in the media tone. International outlets rewrote headlines. "Young African leader challenges Trump, wins global respect," or Traoré's words spark a movement. African pride was no longer a fringe slogan. It had a center, a name, a voice. And yet, while the world watched, the man himself did not stop to bask in attention. Traoré returned home not to celebration, but to the dust and desks of the country he was building. He had said what needed to be said, but now came what needed to be done. That's when the Africa First initiative launched publicly. A plan that wasn't just rhetoric, but real policy. Keep African resources in African hands. End exploitative deals signed in dark rooms. Hold corporations and even local politicians accountable. Build scholarships, startup funding, youth programs targeting the Maliks of the continent. Investigate illegal offshore accounts. Recover stolen wealth and use it to build what colonialism and corruption had left hollow. The boldness shocked some, the clarity inspired others, and soon the effects spread fast. Ghana sent observers. Ethiopia sent economists. Tanzania, and even resource-rich Nigeria sent delegations to learn, listen, coordinate, not to offer help, but to align. A regional leader said during a summit, "We are not poor, we are rich nations with stolen futures. It is time we take them back." This wasn't theory anymore. It was action. And at the center of it all was a man once dismissed as too young, too radical, too different. Now he was called a visionary, a protector. A woman in Dakar tweeted, "He is not a lion because he roars. He is a lion because he protects." Artists painted that phrase on walls across West Africa. Children repeated it in classrooms. Traoré became not a messiah, but a messenger. He didn't ask to be followed. He stood so others would stand with him. He was the match, not the fire. The fire was already in the people. But Traoré never pretended to be the answer. He said it in every speech that followed. "I cannot fix Africa alone. No one can, but I can carry the flame long enough to pass it to the next hand." And people took it. They didn't wait for permission. They began creating, organizing, building, because something had changed. The summit had sparked a current that couldn't be unplugged anymore. In cities and villages, young people launched community farms, crowd-funded water wells, taught each other coding, design, law. Some formed watchdog groups to track where local budgets went. Others repaired roads themselves after being ignored for years. In Burkina Faso, new mining laws were passed prioritizing local ownership. His government signed transparency agreements and released full audits to the public, even when they exposed allies. This was not PR. This was principle. Traoré reminded his team constantly, "If we act like the old Baezes, then we have already lost. We do not rise by copying those who held us down." And beyond Burkina Faso, something was shifting. Governments, once afraid to challenge Western contracts, now spoke openly, reviewing deals, pausing exploitative projects, even demanding renegotiations. The IMF, used to quiet compliance, suddenly found nations asking questions backed by citizens who refused silence. The change wasn't loud, it was consistent, and it was real. What made this movement powerful wasn't perfection, it was honesty. Traoré didn't claim Africa needed saving. He said Africa needed space, to dream, build, decide without manipulation. They say we are unstable, he once said, but who armed our wars? Who crashed our currencies? Who funded dictators and called it stability? These weren't just questions. They were unmaskings. And the more he spoke, the more others stood up. Not just leaders, but teachers, doctors, farmers, grandmothers with stories of what Africa was before it was pillaged, before it was renamed in someone else's language. A new kind of pride was growing, not arrogance, but awareness. Knowledge of what was taken, what remained, and what could return with enough courage. Traoré's greatest power wasn't his title. It was his refusal to dilute the truth so others could feel comfortable. And in that clarity, he gave millions a mirror, not to see what they lacked, but to remember what they had forgotten. That we were not born broken, we were broken into. And now we were gathering the pieces, not to rebuild the same walls, but to plant something that could never be uprooted again. And yet, with all the rising voices, with all the hope flooding the streets and timelines, Traoré never acted like the hero. He knew symbolism fades if not anchored in action. So while murals appeared and praise echoed, he returned each morning to a modest office, meeting with engineers, economists, village elders, crafting policy, not poetry. He visited forgotten towns without warning, listened without cameras, asked what they needed without filters. It wasn't about being seen, it was about seeing. And what he saw was this: Africa's greatest wealth had never been gold or oil. It was belief. Belief in self, belief in future. Belief that we could do more than survive under the shadow of empires. That we could stand, not as victims, but as visionaries. His Africa First initiative expanded quietly yet forcefully. Engineering academies were built in rural zones, training centers opened for young women in tech, medicine, and leadership. Startup loans were offered not just in capitals, but deep inside farming communities. Even prison reform began, with rehabilitation centers replacing rusted jails. Every move was scrutinized, every policy attacked by someone. But Traoré held his ground. He told his critics, "If we delay until it's perfect, we will delay forever." He chose momentum over hesitation, action over fear, hope over cynicism. And slowly, the results showed. Student dropout rates dropped. New local businesses formed faster than foreign franchises could enter. Medicine shortages reduced as supply chains were localized. Even international observers, used to patronizing tones, now arrived in humility, not to advise, but to learn. And the people, they responded not with blind loyalty, but shared ownership. They demanded accountability. They asked harder questions. They wrote open letters and organized town halls. And Traoré welcomed it all. Because real leadership, he believed, doesn't fear scrutiny, it requires it. He often told his ministers, if we need applause to do the right thing, then we're already lost. Instead, he asked only one question after every decision. Did it help someone like Malik? Because Malik was never just one boy. He was every child made invisible by global indifference. Every dreamer crushed by policy written on paper continents away. He was the reason speeches had to become systems, and promises had to become roads, schools, clinics, books. So Traoré kept going. Not louder, not richer, just clearer. And that clarity became contagious. Because truth, once spoken with courage, doesn't return quietly. It becomes a seed in the minds of those who were told their voice didn't matter until they realized it always did. And the world kept watching, but this time not with pity, not with amusement, not with filtered charity campaigns. This time with attention, the kind that comes when something undeniable forces its way into the global narrative. International media, once allergic to African complexity, now found themselves quoting Traoré's words in headlines, editorials, debates, His speech in Geneva became required reading in policy schools from Cape Town to Copenhagen. Diplomats referenced it, professors dissected it, artists remixed it, activists translated it into street protests and campaigns. In New York, a theater collective performed his speech as a spoken word act. In Paris, a bookstore dedicated an entire window to African nonfiction centered on Traoré's ideas. In London, a political podcast host said, "This isn't just African politics anymore. This is global conscience." But even as the outside world reacted, Traoré never changed his rhythm. He refused interviews from sensational outlets. He avoided personality cults. He told his team, "Let the story be the people, not me," and so it was. The story was about nurses in Mali launching a public health app with code learned through a youth grant. A carpenter in Senegal building solar water pumps using designs shared in a regional WhatsApp group. A teacher in rural Togo rewriting textbooks to include pre-colonial African history. An old woman in Niger baking bread to fund local scholarships. All of it inspired by one truth: we had waited long enough. We were moving now, and we weren't asking for permission. And perhaps that's what scared the old powers the most. Not that Traoré had spoken, but that people had listened. Not just to him, but to each other, because unity had always been the threat. Colonialism needed us divided. Globalization preferred us distracted. But the summit in Geneva had cracked something open, and no PR machine could patch it. People across the continent were no longer asking, "Who will lead us?" They were asking, "What can I build?" That question spread faster than any ideology or flag. And though Traoré still carried the torch, he was no longer alone. In Burkina Faso, thousands of youth joined volunteer corps to rebuild rural infrastructure. In Zambia, local councils invited teenagers to advise city planning. In Rwanda, orphan students became startup founders with access to funding for the first time. Even in conflict zones, new networks emerged. Young people refusing to be used as pawns, reclaiming their right to shape peace. So while critics abroad debated whether Traoré was too radical, too fast, too bold, the people simply acted. And action spoke louder than any headline ever could. But not everyone celebrated. Some foreign powers grew nervous. Contracts once untouchable were now being questioned. Supply chains built on silence were interrupted. Offshore accounts froze under investigation as African governments began sharing data, coordinating audits, mapping the flow of stolen wealth back to its source. Some corporations pulled out, threatening collapse. Traoré called their bluff. "If your presence depends on our suffering, you were never partners." And he meant it. Instead of chasing replacement investors, his administration focused on building internal strength. Small-scale manufacturing was supported. Cooperatives were funded. Rural agriculture was revived using indigenous methods, not imported blueprints. They trained not just engineers, but ethical engineers. Not just doctors, but healers rooted in the needs of their people. The model wasn't perfect. It wasn't instant. It faced resistance. But it was real. And more importantly, it was theirs. Because for the first time in decades, policies weren't being written in distant boardrooms or signed under pressure from financial institutions. They were being drafted in native languages, discussed on community radio stations, debated in markets, and printed on the walls of local schools for all to read. Transparency wasn't a trend, it was a tool. Because what had always made the people vulnerable wasn't ignorance, it was exclusion. Once they knew the numbers, knew the names, knew the plans, they could protect themselves. And in that new clarity, something beautiful happened. Trust began to return. Not in politics alone, but in each other, in neighbors, in communities, in the belief that maybe, just maybe, we could fix what was broken, not by magic, but by momentum. The international reaction remained mixed. Some leaders admired from afar, too hesitant to try. Some mocked quietly, waiting for failure. Some sent envoys to copy, not credit. But it didn't matter, the shift had already happened. Traoré didn't need the world's applause. He only needed Africa's awakening, and every week, it showed more. Mothers who once had to choose between medicine and food now ran local clinics. Dads who once left for cities in desperation returned to build homes and train apprentices. Young girls once told leadership wasn't for them stood at village forums holding microphones with steady hands. The story was no longer about one speech, one president, or even one country. It was about the reclaiming of destiny, not by decree but by daily decision. It was about what happens when people stop waiting for saviors and start becoming builders. Traoré often said, "We don't rise through magic. We rise through memory. Remember who we were, remember who we are, and dare to become something the world never expected, unstoppable." And so the final lesson was never about Traoré alone. It was never about one stage, one speech, or one confrontation. It was about a truth that had been buried for generations and was now unearthed not with rage, but with resolve. Africa was no longer whispering. It was speaking. And not just in anger, but in direction, with clarity, with unity, with self-definition. The speech in Geneva became a memory, but the movement it sparked became a reality. In village after village, you could hear it, you could feel it. In the way children spoke of dreams without shame, in the way old men told their histories not as victims, but as witnesses. In the way women organized beyond survival and into leadership. This wasn't about going back to some golden past. It was about finally claiming the future, a future designed by those who live it, not those who extract from it. Traoré remained humble despite global recognition. He still walked without bodyguards into city squares, still sat with farmers under trees to discuss seed rotation, still answered questions from school children with the same seriousness he gave to heads of state. Because he understood that the center of power was not a palace, it was the people. And when asked in an interview what he feared most, he answered simply that we forget what started this. Because forgetting is how systems win again. Forgetting is how silence returns. Forgetting is how exploitation gets rebranded as partnership again. But as long as people remembered Malik, remembered the minds, remembered the hands that built and bled and carried, then the movement could not die. It would evolve. It would pass from speech to law, from law to habit, from habit to culture. And when culture changes, so does destiny. And that's where we leave it. Not with a hero, but with a harvest. Not with a conclusion, but a continuation. Because there is no final chapter here. Only the next voice to rise, the next child to stand, the next truth to break through. If you're still listening, then you are part of this story too. Because the real power of what happened that day wasn't just that Traoré spoke. It was that the world finally listened. And once a people learn to listen to themselves again, they cannot be silenced again. Africa is not asking to be seen anymore. She is standing, and this time she will not step back.